As we continue our study in the life of Joseph, we come next to comments regarding the literary context. It's interesting in chapter 39 that we encounter the expression in the lips of someone who is not an Israelite, "Look, a Hebrew." The person speaking is Potiphar's wife. "Look, this Hebrew has been brought to make sport of us." Now, what's interesting in this little note is as follows. Typically, the Israelites, descendants of Abraham, would not refer to themselves as Hebrews among themselves. But if identifying their origin, their clan, their ethnicity to a foreigner, they would say, "We are Hebrews." So it's appropriate that a foreigner, that is someone outside of Abraham's clan, in this case Potiphar's wife, she identifies Joseph with this ethnic term, a Hebrew. This is very appropriate. This is how it's done. Next we come to the Tale of Two Brothers. This is an Egyptian document dated to about 1225 BC. Here's the situation. As scholars study the biblical material, and they come to this struggle between Potiphar and Joseph, some are inclined to wonder whether or not this may have been borrowed from in the Egyptian Tale of Two Brothers. Two individuals, and in the Egyptian account, they are actually siblings. Notice that's unlike Potiphar and Joseph, who are not siblings. One brother accuses the other of having violated his wife. Now, there is the similarity with the Potiphar account, isn't it? Potiphar is told, falsely, by his wife that Joseph has made sexual overtures to her. And that is a lie. Now, in the case of the Tale of Two Brothers, also, it is not true. That is to say, the allegations are not true. The younger brother has not made sexual overtures to his brother's wife. But before that becomes evident, the brother who feels that he has been wronged takes extreme measures in order to slay the brother he thinks is guilty. In the Egyptian tale, there are mythical components that come to the aid of the wrongly accused brother. There are animals that talk. There is a protective earth which casts up a sea to divide brother from brother so that the angry brother will be stopped from carrying out his misguided vengeance. And the outcome is different. In the Tale of Two Brothers, the innocent is exonerated and they are reunited. But not so with the Joseph account. He is wrongly accused and he is framed, wrongly convicted, and put in prison. So we exit this little discussion aware of the fact there's no demonstrable link with the story of angry Potiphar, innocent Joseph, and the Egyptian document Tale of Two Brothers. But you want to be aware that some will want to make a link, and there are some remote parallels or similarities. This next piece from literary context comes from much later, but you might find it interesting, as I did when I came across it. It has to do with Joseph's garment in the Potiphar situation, Potiphar's wife. You'll recall that in his diligence to flee the scene when Potiphar's wife is making advances on him, which actually is a very wonderful strategy of his, something that a New Testament writer will advocate. When he does that, he leaves his garment behind. Some tunic or cloak is left behind in her grasping clutches. When the Quran retells this story, and if you're not aware, the Quran retells many stories from the Hebrew Bible. When it retells this story, there's a little addition which is really quite intriguing. And it goes roughly like this. The story is told that subsequently there were a group of elders who were brought together in order to determine whether or not Joseph was guilty or innocent. And they ask this question concerning Joseph's garment. Was it torn in the front or was it torn in the back? Picture that exit of Joseph for a moment and see if you can figure out the significance of this intriguing courtroom question. Was Joseph's coat torn in front or in back? Can you see how this would influence their assessment of Joseph's guilt or innocence? You see, if it was torn in front, then presumably Mrs. Potiphar, as we might call her, has been acting defensively to interfere with his overtures unwanted towards her. But if it's torn in back, then she is clutching after him as he is fleeing. Well, as the Quranic edition continues, they discover that the garment is torn in back, which ought to exonerate Joseph, and in fact shows him to be innocent. But then the response comes, well, actually, though, Joseph is such a handsome fellow, so good looking, that I could not help myself, in essence, is what Potiphar's wife says. And so they say, well, yes, I guess he's guilty after all, even though she was the one who made the overtures. And so Joseph, in keeping with the biblical account, Joseph winds up in prison. But I thought you might enjoy that the fact that the Quran takes up the story and has an interesting embellishment on it. A few more elements from the literary context. First has to do with the actual lexeme, the word that's used in chapter 41, verse 8, pronounced chartumim, which represents magicians. Magicians. It's interesting to be aware that this term was likely not indigenous to the Hebrew language, but was an Egyptian loanword, not an Assyrian, an Egyptian loanword. And it shows up in this account purported to take place in Egypt. That's interesting, isn't it? Next, when Joseph is given a signet ring, and that ring is known as the taba'at, this likely derives from an Egyptian term, gebat. So once again, part of the court setting, in this case, a symbol of his investiture, his elevation to the position of Grand Vizier, involves receiving this ring, and itself may be a word derived from an Egyptian word. Last on this screen, there is a term which has puzzled Hebrew readers of the Hebrew Bible in chapter 41, verse 43. You'll generally see it rendered make way. The Hebrew word is avrek, and it may be better understood if we recognize it not as a Hebrew word, but as an Egyptian word, abrek, which would have the meaning attention, or please come to attention because someone of eminence is passing by. That fits the context. And now we take up the viewpoint of a literary theme, not literary particulars, lexemes, and so forth, but a theme running through this account. It has to do with how Joseph responded to his brothers when they came before him. By way of review then, you've read the text, but by way of review, initially he imprisoned all of them for 3 days, all the brothers that came on the first trip to purchase a supply of grain. And then he dismissed them with the exception of Simeon, keeping him behind as the other brothers returned home with grain. There is another test involving returning the grain purchase money initially, and then asking them to bring Benjamin along. I don't know if you recognize this as a test, but when Benjamin's older brother Joseph was alone with the brothers, he was at great risk. What will happen when Benjamin, the younger brother of the favorite brother, and now he's the youngest son and a precious son to his father Jacob, what will happen to Benjamin when Benjamin is alone with these brothers who in the past have been malevolent? Then there's the second return of the grain money. What will they do with this? Will they hide it or will they acknowledge it? There is the locating of Joseph's prediction cup, his magical silver cup, which is his unique property, framing the brothers, in particular, framing Benjamin as a thief. How will they respond? How will they respond when Benjamin now is cast into prison, allegedly as a thief? If we look back over these, we can see that each one of these actions were imposed specifically by Joseph, sometimes with intrigue, that is to say, claiming that they had stolen the cup when in fact they had not. So these are contrived by Joseph. So a question for us to consider: why do you think Joseph went to these lengths to test his brothers? What's going on? We'll circle around to offer a suggestion for this later in the lecture. There's another theme that runs parallel to this, which may affect our grasp of the first question: why did Joseph test his brothers? It has to do with the recurring mention of tears on the part of Joseph himself. First of all, when he hears and understands what Reuben is saying to the other 9 brothers, we find Joseph secretly weeping. Let's take a moment to review that particular episode. Joseph, unbeknownst to them, that is to say his identity is still hidden, he has just announced that he's going to leave Simeon in prison, and he's insisting that they bring their younger brother, whom they claim to have at home, to bring their younger brother to prove that they are brothers and not spies. And so they respond in 21 with anguish. Alas, we are paying for the penalty for what we did to our brother. And now they're talking about Joseph. We saw his anguish when he pleaded with us, but we would not listen. That is why this anguish has come on us. And now Reuben interjects, didn't I tell you not to wrong the boy? That is, not to wrong Joseph. You would not listen, so now there comes a reckoning for his blood. Joseph is understanding them, although they don't realize it. And in verse 24, he turns away from them and he weeps. And then he speaks to them. And it's at this point that he picks out Simeon and binds him. So Joseph tears upon hearing how Reuben is remonstrating his brothers concerning the kidnapping and sale of Joseph. Joseph also sheds tears when he catches sight of his blood brother, full brother Benjamin. And later in chapter 45, when Judah pleads on Benjamin's behalf, saying, "Let me stay in place of him." Finally, Joseph will weep at his father's death. And so I wonder, what may this trail of tears, especially the first 3, not including grief at his father's grave, his father's death, what does this suggest, perhaps, concerning Joseph's motive for testing the brothers in the several tests of the previous slide? Together with his sequence, we want to be aware that it was at the point of Judah saying, "Let me take the place of Benjamin. I cannot bear to let my father experience grief by being deprived of his son Benjamin." That is what tips the balance for Joseph. And at that point, in chapter 45, he reveals his identity to them. It's such a powerful passage, we really must take a moment to read it. Picking up from Genesis 44, verse 32, this is Judah pleading with this powerful Egyptian bureaucrat, whom he doesn't realize is his brother, Joseph. "For your servant," that's the way Judah refers to himself, became an insurance policy for the boy," this is referring to Benjamin, "to my father," that would be Jacob, saying, "If I do not bring him back to you, then I will bear the blame in the sight of my father all my life. Now, therefore, please let your servant," that's Judah, "remain as a slave to my lord," that's Joseph, "in place of the boy, and let the boy go back with his brothers." And then notice this powerful rhetorical question, for how can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? I fear to see the suffering that would come upon my father. Notice the impact this has on Joseph. Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him. He cried out, "Send everyone away from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it. The household of Pharaoh heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father alive?" Powerful and pathos-filled. So what does this trail of tears speak to Joseph's motive in establishing this succession of tests? One thing a conclusion it prevents me from coming to is that he is just angry and hard-hearted. Early on, as early as in chapter 42, he is moved to tears. And on seeing Benjamin, he's moved to tears. And then he is still going to imprison Benjamin and make it look like he's guilty. What's going on with this vizier? Incidentally, if you're wondering to yourself, why is it that they are not able to recognize Joseph at this point? It might be worth looking at the elapse of time. For one thing, in addition to the elapse of time, he's clothed in official attire. Remember that picture of King Tutankhamun on that gold foil relief thrown back? Just a splendid, splendid display of power and regal jewelry. Second, he's using an interpreter. All they're hearing is Egyptian. They presume that he doesn't understand them, that they don't know his language. And then there's this, the elapse of time. We can actually extrapolate there 22 years have passed since they saw him trek off with the Midianite slave traders. Age 17, when he was kidnapped, he is elevated, that is, moved into the Grand Vizier role after 13 years. And then 7 years of plenty and 2 years of famine have gone by, and they're in the middle of 2 of 7 years of famine, and that tallies up to 22 years. A long time has passed since they saw him last. I'd like to offer some thoughts then regarding this question that I've posed to you, the reasons for Joseph's tests. Keep in mind that the brothers have appeared before him, requesting an opportunity to trade, to buy grain, to sustain them during the famine, and they have said, "We are brothers, and we are honest men." Consider that. We are brothers, and think of that term deeply, not just a mere biological connection. The administrator on Pharaoh's behalf, namely Joseph, contends in contrast, "I don't think so. I think you're spies." Now, consider, he was responsible for protecting the nation. Any bureaucrat in his level would have that responsibility. And he claims, "No, you've come to see how weak we are, and then to mount some kind of a counterattack. I think you're spies." As strong as Egypt was, from time to time, they suffered military advances. They had to be on their guard. They had guard posts on the frontiers of the land, of their territory, particularly between Canaan or Palestine and Egypt. They're in the Suez territory. They had military posts up there for this very reason. So Joseph's contention, the language he uses, is very suitable for someone in his role when met by a foreigner. And so the tests we have seen, would they return the stolen money? Well, let me rephrase that. Would they take the money that was returned to them and then hide it and steal it, in essence, instead of coming back and saying, "It looks like you overlooked our payment"? That would have been easy to do, wouldn't it? Think of it. That would have been completely easy to do. Would they substitute a false Benjamin? Would they bring someone instead of Benjamin? Now, if they are not brothers, then they have to bring in another fellow that would make their story ring true. Now, of course, we know it is a true story. There is an actual Benjamin. And when they have the actual Benjamin in tow, how would they treat him along the way? Would they treat him like they treated Benjamin's older brother Joseph? In that environment, Benjamin is put at risk, first in transit, and then if that's not enough, Joseph throws him in prison. He's in great risk. How are these people who claim to be brothers? Again, notice that word. I feel this is operating on a very profound level. It takes us, frankly, all the way back to Cain and Abel, doesn't it? Cain was willing to acknowledge that Abel was his brother, but he pushed back against God's question, what am I, my brother's keeper? Well, in fact, Cain had not behaved in a brotherly fashion. And that's what Joseph is testing about these 10. What about their attitude towards their father? When they cooked up the plan to pass off Joseph as dead and saw their father go through grief, they didn't seem to care much about that. Do they still hold no concern for the feelings of their father if they should have to return without Benjamin? I am inclined to think that the complex of tests that Joseph has set up are an opportunity for these brothers to show whether or not they are truly brothers in the richest, most positive sense of the word. And if they have finally become what they were not before, that, well, they were brothers, but only in DNA. They were not brothers in the sense of really caring for all the members of their family. If they have turned and become brothers, then there's a possibility that Joseph can trust them as he never could do before. And if he can trust them, that opens the way for there to be reconciliation with these brothers who were not brothers when he last met them. In this story is, I believe, a rich lesson and model for us today in our relationships with friends, with family members, with acquaintances, among disciples who are following Christ. There is the tendency, when we have been wronged, perhaps to issue a blanket forgiveness, for the gospel of Christ requires this, right? Issue a blanket forgiveness, but then in essence to follow it on, I forgive you, but I don't want to see you again. Now let's acknowledge when someone has wronged us, it's appropriate for us to set up healthy boundaries to protect our safety on whatever level. If it's been physical damage, then for physical safety, psychological damage, then for psychological safety, and so forth. Barriers are reasonable, and we do not wish in any means to suggest that there should be a cheap trust. That would simply be folly. That would be hazardous. So boundaries are reasonable. What I find especially, though, convincing and persuasive and winsome about the Joseph account is that Joseph is unwilling to stop there. He has been wronged. He's got safe barriers in place, that in this case, the barriers of anonymity. He has not revealed who he is. But then he is willing to go to, frankly, great lengths to give these brothers an opportunity to demonstrate whether or not they could now be trusted. He does not trust them instantly, but he lets them prove themselves. This speaks to me that of, number one, Joseph's just immensely magnificent ultimate goal. He wants to be reconciled, not just to issue forgiveness. He wants to be reconciled. And number two, he's willing to go to great lengths to see if reconciliation is reasonable. How will he know whether or not he can move that direction? By seeing if there's been a change of character. Phenomenal lesson for anyone in relationship today, and especially for people who are seeking to follow the Messiah. Here is another question that's supplied in the context of the literary context. and it has to do with chapter 38. Some have suggested that this chapter 38 disrupts the Joseph story, and this is true. We have Joseph material, the kidnapping, in chapter 37, and then we resume the Joseph material in 39, but the Judah and Tamar material occupies chapter 38. Why this disruption? Some have suggested that it's nothing more than marking time, as if to say, meanwhile, back at the ranch, here's what's going on with some of Joseph's other brothers, but that's not really central to the story. And okay, now we're ready to resume with the Joseph account because a little time has elapsed. Why do you suppose that the Tamar material was included? What light does it shed? And if you have opportunity, I commend to you an insightful article by Richard Clifford, and you can see the site there on the screen. After you've given a little thought to this question, I invite you to continue with the lecture, and I'll offer some thoughts that have occurred to me, and you'll find them similar to and developed more fully in some respects to Professor Clifford's article. It seems to me that what's going on with chapter 38 is documentation of transformation within Judah's character. Judah becomes a very primary figure as the Joseph story continues. Notice earlier, he was the one who advised selling Joseph. This was at the kidnapping scene. Now, admittedly, this might have been a protective statement. We need to allow that. Sell is better than kill, right? On the other hand, it may have been, frankly, something of a businessman's approach. Hey, what use is he to us dead? Let's at least collect some money off of him by selling him. In any case, he is not arguing for setting Joseph free as Reuben had done. Now, as we come to this story in 38, as unpleasant as it is, Tamar being cheated from the opportunity to have a child through the normal customs, and needing to use subterfuge to become pregnant by her father-in-law. After Tamar is shown to be with child, and she has not married, because after all, Judah has prevented her from having relations with another of her brothers-in-law, as would have been the normal case for the widow. Then she is set up and about to be punished, to be executed for this. But when it turns out that Judah is actually the father, then he makes a phenomenal statement. Think of the position difference in a patriarchal society. He is a man, she is a woman, and he is the elder figure, the father-in-law, and she daughter-in-law. All of this, he comes out and says, she is more righteous than I am. This is just an incredible, incredible confession. These next lines, Judah addresses to his father, Jacob, as he is asking Jacob to entrust Benjamin to him. He stands up and says, I will bear the blame forever. I personally will. And that contrasts how one of his brothers tried to pledge security for Benjamin. Judah, on his part, says, I personally, not someone else, not one of my children, but I personally will bear the blame forever. This is a statement of responsibility, just as in the Tamar incident, he was taking responsibility for his actions or inactions. And then appearing before Joseph, when he pleads for Joseph to accept himself, Judah, in place of Benjamin, who has been framed for stealing the silver cup. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? No. Hear the anguish within his voice. Here are some additional pieces to this puzzle or picture. It has to do with the progressive elevation of Judah, his ascendancy among his brothers. In chapter 44, as they enter Joseph's house, the writer tells us that Judah and his brothers entered. Judah is given prominence here. Later on, we read that Jacob sends Judah to Pharaoh in order to derive directions how to reach the sector of Egypt that they are now relocating to. Judah will be the one entrusted for that messenger role. Towards the end of Jacob's life, as we examine the various blessings that he imparts to his several sons, the blessing given to Judah actually surpasses Joseph's blessing. It's a very premier blessing. And so it seems that Judah has actually elevated to the leading son. We might have thought that it would have been Joseph. Joseph has such a heroic role, and as has been observed by others, prefiguring a messianic role, one rescuing his people after experiencing suffering, that sort of general typology. But could it be that Judah, as the narrator is reporting this story, is being chronicled as climbing in prominence and trust? In case you're wondering where he is in the birth order, let's take a look at this particular slide. As we noted earlier, the numerals ahead of the names indicate birth order. So firstborn by right should have been Reuben. However, he violated Bilhah, one of the handmaidens in the family structure, and this disallowed him. And then Simeon, together with his brother Levi, behaved with excessive, vengeful, murderous violence in their effort to make things right, balancing the scales of justice after Dinah was violated. And this will cause them to lose their place as the next premier sons, the eldest son role. So you see that among all the 12 sons of Jacob, it is Judah who is next in line. But not only is he next in line, we are seeing particularly evident in the Tamar incident that he is one who has experienced evidently at least a strengthening of his character, if not an actual conversion of character, over against how he behaved when Joseph was being kidnapped. He seems to have been complicit to that. That's the fact that he doesn't stand up and stop it, and he may have actually been trying to enrich himself through that. So there seems to be a change, a transformation in the character of Judah, and it's my conviction that the Tamar story is inserted very strategically in the stream of the Joseph story, so that when Judah turns up and behaves as he does, pleading for Benjamin's life and being the point at which Joseph's dam of reticence and isolation and anonymity breaks in tears and he discloses himself, Judah is the one able to do that, because Judah has a heart, a character that has come through from deception and manipulation into humility and honesty at great sacrifice to himself. And so it is that Judah comes to the top. This will be significant in later centuries as the tribe of Judah becomes the premier tribe within the tribes of Israel. But right now we see it figured in the individual, Judah himself. Already we have begun to introduce some theological concepts, haven't we? And let's continue along that line with some lessons that can be drawn from the story of Joseph. As an individual, the encouragement by his model is just exceptional. Hold steadfast even in times when we're treated unfairly. A New Testament writer brings this out. Do you recognize those words? suffering when we're treated unfairly. We should bear up under that. We should remain willing to serve. He winds up as a slave in Potiphar's house, and yet he comes to the top because he's willing to serve faithfully there, willing to serve the Pharaoh instead of simply looking for a way to get out. Remaining open to God's voice. There's one point when he protests the temptation to do wrong, and he says, how could I do that if I am actually in the service of God? I can't do that. So he remains open to God's voice, and consequently God is able to give him further communications, even in the form of explicit dream interpretation. Explicitly fleeing immorality. There's no need for any kind of embellishment or symbolic interpretation. Just plain and simply, he is one who faces into sexual temptation and says, no, I'm not going that direction. This is an example worthy of imitation. And as we've developed this thought of the tests imposed by Joseph on his brothers, seeing that as a pathway to reconciliation, this stands for us as a brilliant model, just a splendid model of how we also should, as much as possible, pursue reconciliation with others. By the way, there come points in the efforts of restoration where it's imperative that it be bilateral. In other words, if the other party to whom you are making overtures to test trust in the interest of reconciliation, if the other party remains uninterested or proves still to be untrustworthy, then the reconciliation cannot go full course. In other words, it's not entirely on you or on me. It has to do also with cooperation from the other party. But at least we owe it to God and to them to endeavor to attempt. From time to time in this study, we're checking in with the picture of God presented by the biblical writer and comparing it with the picture of God that sometimes people in our day and age hold, arising from, they suppose, the Old Testament. And they suppose that the God of the Old Testament is a rather upset and angry God, a vengeful God. So we raise that question again. What did Adam and Eve deserve, reaching all the way back to the prehistory, the primeval material? What did they deserve over against what did they get for their disobedience? I think we'd agree that they received mercy. What about Cain after fratricide, murder? What did he deserve? What would have been equivalent consequence for the deed that he committed? And instead, what did he actually receive? In the case of Adam and Eve and Cain, they received a degree of expulsion, but not the penalty that we understood them to deserve. When we consider Noah's society before the flood, the question now has to do with timing. When? How soon did Noah's society, and it's just terrible and irreversible violent evil, when did it deserve judgment? Keep in mind how long it took for Noah to build the boat. The ark, was it not 100 years? And that then constituted a period of mercy, a period of delay. God did not instantly respond with the flood, but it took time. It took time before that consequence finally came. Delay is a form of mercy. We see that delay factor also regarding the land which God promises to Abraham and his offspring, the land of Canaan. At the time of Abraham, it was inhabited by the Amorites. How swiftly does he judge them? For he says to Abraham in Genesis 15:16, "It's not your land yet, because some time must elapse before they prove to deserve the land no longer and to be overwhelmed and expelled, judged for it." It will be some 400 years before God finally says to the Amorites, "Time is up. You have no longer any chance to prove to be worthy to continue here. That period of delay is once again mercy. How about Jacob? What did he deserve? Time after time he acts as the trickster, using deceit. Finally, he gets a little bit of his own medicine, doesn't he, from Laban, as Laban tricks him on a couple of occasions, treats him harshly. But we find that God pursues Jacob, even to the point of speaking his own language. Jacob is something of a wrestler, wrestling his way through life to get what he wants. And God speaks that metaphoric language of wrestling until finally Jacob determines that he must have God's blessing above all else. Did Jacob deserve that many chances? Is this a vengeful God? I don't think so. This is a God who's seeking to create opportunities for people to turn to him. And so, as we observe this immaculate behavior of Joseph under unfair circumstances in the extreme, incarceration, enslavement, the prison life, could it be that as Joseph lives out these responses to hardship, and as we see him reaching out to his brothers to give them a second chance, could it be that he is in fact imitating the same merciful God that we see responding with mercy time after time? I think we may have in Joseph someone who's learning to live out the mercy that he knows is there in the heart of God. Genesis can be recapped or reviewed as follows. We begin in a pristine fashion at creation. What follows is disobedience on the part of the first couple, death in fratricide, and certainly death in terms of a spiritual death, separation from God, and eventual death of Adam and Eve. And then follows the deluge, the flood, and the scattering of the nations in Genesis 11, keeping in mind Von Rod's encouragement that we recognize this as humanity's hope for a future breaking off in shrill dissonance, a real picture of despair. But on the heels of that, God moves in with the deliverance that he promised, frankly, to Eve, that eventually one of his offspring, her offspring, would crush the serpent's head, would bruise the serpent's head. Abraham won't be the ultimate Messiah, but deliverance comes anew. That is begun with a family. In the chapter 12, the introduction of Abraham, his call, particularly there in chapter 12. A man of refined faith. Isaac we've labeled as his father's echo. And then God working through this rascally fellow of Jacob, eventually putting him in a place where he's insistent on having God's blessing, which is a wonderful place to come. May we reach that place without having to wrestle as much as Jacob did through life. And Joseph, perhaps you've come up with another title for him. Here's a title that occurs to me. He is the rescuer of the family group, isn't he? By being able to provide grain for them during famine and a place to live. But he gets to that post not easily, but by being rejected by his own people, and even rejected by Potiphar as he was framed. But eventually, God in his faithfulness raises him to a place where he can, in wisdom, administer a rescue for the nation of Egypt and extend a protective umbrella for God's particular family, the family of Jacob. This concludes our study of the book of Genesis.